What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we are doing the fuel system for our turbo K24 swap Subaru BRZ. Let's do it. So we are going to start off by looking at some wiring related things. Now for this setup, you've got a fuel pump ECU, which is behind this big sort of side trim piece on the passenger side of the vehicle. What we need to do is actually disconnect the connector that goes to the fuel pump ECU, because essentially what we're trying to do is bypass that. KPower has a part of their fuel kit, a relay that you're using to essentially bypass the stock fuel pump ECU. And in order to get to that, we've got to remove this entire plastic trim piece that goes up next to the door. So what we're gonna have to do is actually bring these back seats down, because there's some pop clips back here that we've got to remove. And I'm sure there's gonna be some other clips and plastic bits that we're gonna have to pull off to be able to get this whole trim piece pulled out. So we're gonna have these two pop clips, 1 and 2, that we're gonna have to remove, because this piece actually slides in behind this little carpety piece. And then maybe, I don't think we have to disconnect the seat belt. I think we can keep the seat belt intact and still get this out. But we'll have to sort of take a look around to see what else we need to do to get this whole trim piece pulled out. So when you're going to take this passenger seat out, what you're going to have to do is remove the one bolt that's at the front. And then once you have this guy tilted up, you're going to need to take the back of this and press straight down, because there is a little loop at the back here. And that little loop goes onto a hook all the way at the back here. And yes, in fact, I did need to do that, because there's another little pop tab right here. All right, so I've got the whole panel pulled out here. This is the inside, obviously. And the tricky part to this is that there's all of these little sort of pointed clips here. These guys, that you could kind of see. I was having to reach my arm all the way back in here and then try and really pull on these sort of pillars to get these tabs to sort of pop out. So when you're trying to reach in behind this guy, you're gonna have to get your arm in here and try and pop out. Oh, that is really quite overexposed. But yeah, you're gonna have to try and pop out all of the little white clips there. So now that we've got this guy out of the way, we can start to actually take a look at the relay that we're going to be using to replace the fuel pump ECU. We're gonna take a look at this relay here. This connector goes into the stock fuel pump ECU. And if we zoom in, get a little bit closer of a look here, see how this attaches. You know what, I might just unbolt this little 10 mil bolt, pop this guy out to the side, and just pull this whole thing off so we can get that out of there a little easier. Uninstalled. Now we can sort of see how this is connected here. We might need a little flathead, or we might not. Yeah, so there's this tiny little white tab here. We need to push down on that, and then this whole little assembly should come out. So now there's your stuck fuel pump ECU. So if you need to replace this, you can. I don't think we're actually even really going to be using this, because we're going to be de-pinning all 5 of these wires and connecting them into this. This is our new relay that allows the fuel pump to prime for 5 seconds before starting the engine. So what we're going to need to do is disconnect this part of this connector here at the top that has all of these colors painted on it. And the reason that the colors are painted on there is because of the fact that when you go to de-pin this, you're already color coordinated, so all of these pins or all of these wires are going to go straight back into this new connector. And thankfully, as a part of KPower's fuel kit setup, they actually include a tiny, tiny little screwdriver that should allow you to disconnect the wires from this original connector. So I believe the way that I'm going to try to do this is take this tiny little flathead that they provided, so you can see how all of these little grooves sort of come together. There's actually a piece here on the top. So what you're actually going to want to do is slip your little flathead down in. There's a little wedge, and you'll see it when you know it. You'll know it when you see it. So you can actually slip this down in there and pull off the little cap piece that is connecting and holding all of these tabs down. Oh, there we go. This little piece right here is what we're talking about. You can slip that little flathead in there and actually pull this little piece off the top, and that should make it easier to de-pin all of these wires. So the main reason why I was having so much trouble pulling these out was because of the fact that this electrical tape and sort of sheath that they've got installed on here was just too far down. It was choked up too far on the actual wires, so I didn't have enough room to pull these longer little pins out of the connector sort of body, if you will. So what we need to do at this point is simply take all of these little pins that we've just pulled out and put them into our new connector, which is color coded. This guy right here. So you can see there's red, black, blue, silver, and green, and that corresponds to 5 out of the 6 wires that are in this group. The only one that we're not going to be using is there's a very small gauge wire that is a white and black stripe. So we're not going to be using that one. Let's move that out of the way. So all we're going to do is take these pins in the same orientation that they went into the original connector. We're going to put them into the new one with the color codes. Obviously, the red wire goes in the red slot, blue into blue, and so on. Now, this connector does have another one of those similar pieces that goes on top. So for right now, I'm just gonna slide this up in here. Oh, don't lose it. Don't lose that. And then simply just pin these to the new connector. And so there you go. We've got red going into red, black going into black, the smaller blue wire going into blue, gray going into gray, or silver, if you want to say silver into silver. And then all the way on this side, we've got green going into green. So now that is pinned correctly. So now we can take our little E-shaped tab and put that guy right back where it came from. And that is very much in place. And so what KPower did in their installation guide was they actually reconnected this original connector onto the one wire that they're not using. So we'll go with that, just because, I mean, obviously this is not going to reattach to the fuel pump ECU. This is actually not even going to get used. So you can either reinstall this or just leave it in here, or you can just remove it altogether, which I don't really see much of a need to keep this in there. And I might be able to sell it on eBay for a few bucks. So we'll just leave that out for now. But now all you're gonna do is take the new relay that you got with your setup and just connect this new connector that we just repinned with all of those new wires into the relay. So that is gonna go, I believe, this way. Yep, and just like that. Now, if you wanted to, you could find a good way to sort of try to secure this onto here so that it doesn't move around too much. There's a little hole right here on this new relay and mount it up in the same spot just so that it's not, you know, flopping around. And with that in place and more or less holding relatively steady, we can just put our trim piece back in, and that will wrap up the wiring section. Well, for the most part, that will wrap up the wiring section for the inside of this install, and we can go work on injectors, fuel rails, intake manifold, all the rest of that in the engine bay. For the fuel lines, you're actually only going to need one of the 3 lines that are, you know, normally attached to the stock engine. And the one that you're going to need is the one that is closest to the front of the car. the closest to like the nose of the car, right? So these other two, the one in the middle of the three and the one at the back of the three, are not going to be used. You can either cap these lines or you can remove them altogether. I'm gonna take a shot at trying to remove these two lines, but for now, let's just go ahead and do some of the easy work, and that is just removing all three of these hoses, because these two are gonna come off and they're gonna stay off, whereas the one that we're actually gonna use, we're going to use the hard line that comes up and actually provides the fuel, but we don't need this line itself. I'm gonna be running E85, so I have the KPower E85 kit, but if you're not doing that, if you're just using the standard setup, they do provide a hose that attaches onto the hard line and then feeds the fuel rail directly, whereas the E85 kit has a line that comes up, it feeds your ethanol sensor, and then it goes into the fuel rail. For now, let's just get these three lines pulled off of here. All right, so simply pulling on them, twisting, and just trying to get them off is not working for me. If you can pull them off and have it work for you, great. You don't need to retain any of these three lines for this swap. So I am just gonna start cutting the bottoms of these in vertical slits just to try and get these dang hoses off, because frankly, I'm over it. With the old lines out of the way, let's kind of just talk about the new lines and how we're going to do that. If you're running the sort of standard fuel setup and you're not using the ethanol E85 kit, this is the hose that they are going to include. And this guy will go onto, again, the frontmost fuel line. The middle one and the back one are not going to be used. They will be plugged and or removed altogether. And so if you're running the standard fuel setup, this guy is going to go onto the front of, or the front fuel line, and then this quick disconnect, this is a 5/16 quick disconnect, this guy will attach onto the backside of the fuel rail over here once it's attached onto your intake manifold. Because of the fact that we're running the E85 kit, let's talk about that. In the E85 kit, instead of one long hose, you actually get two shorter hoses. Now, this one has quick disconnects on both sides, and this guy has a quick disconnect only on one side and an open end on the other. The open end is going to go on your fuel line, your front fuel line right here is attached to the chassis, and then this quick disconnect on that line, and then the quick disconnect on this side will attach to your ethanol sensor. So it'll go into one side and then come out the other. All it's really doing is just sort of passing through this sensor. It's not really impeding the flow at all, but it's basically just measuring the ethanol content. And then the other cable, one end has a straight quick disconnect, the other has a 90-degree bend. The straight one will go onto the opposite end of your ethanol sensor, and the 90-degree end will come back here and attach onto the backside of your fuel rail, right around here-ish. And the E85 kit also includes this pigtail transfer connector cable, whatever you want to call it. The orange side or brown side, which however you see that, goes onto your ethanol sensor, whichever way it goes, like so. And then this little 8-pin connector is going to go onto the 8-pin that is on your chassis harness. Now that we've reviewed all that, I think what I want to do is actually try to pull those two fuel lines out, and there is actually a little bit of work that we need to get under the car and go all the way towards the back of the car where the fuel pump lives and disconnect those two lines from that end. And then if you want to, you can go through the effort of actually removing those two lines altogether. So let's jump under the car and we'll take a look at that. Now that we are under the car, we can take a look at the fuel lines and how it pertains to how they connect into the fuel pump. I am currently looking towards the front of the vehicle, and if you come underneath the driver's side and you're underneath the frame here, you'll see that there's 5 of these hard lines. 3 of these are fuel lines, and they are larger than these other 2. I think those are either for the brakes, or maybe they're for ABS for the rear wheels, or something along those lines. But so the 3 lines that we're looking at are the thicker lines out of the group of 5. And the one that we need to keep is actually the one that's with the group of 3, the one that is with the other 2 small lines. This is the fuel line that runs to the very front of the engine. It's closest to the front of the engine, and that is what KPower says is what you're going to be using for your fuel feed. So with that in mind, if we were to follow these lines all the way back, you'd get to this section where you can see this connector here and this connector here. Now, one of the lines, this guy right here, that we are planning to keep, that connector obviously is going to stay connected. So this connector here for the fuel line that we're not going to be using, this guy can be pulled off and plugged with the aluminum plug that KPower provides as a part of their fuel kit. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and pull this connector off and go ahead and just plug it, and we might just zip tie these 2 together for now. Keep in mind that there's probably fuel in these lines, so you may want to have some paper towels on hand, and definitely don't stick your face directly underneath this when you unplug it so that you don't get a face full of gasoline. Just giving this a little shake to try and pull out any of the fuel that's left in this line. And so now we're going to use this aluminum plug. We're going to insert, so this guy, you can see it has like a flat tab on the end, and then it has this right here. So this end, the end with not a tab on it, that end is going to go into the fuel line that we just disconnected. So with that line disconnected, you want to make sure that you get this little white clip that's part of the quick disconnect, and reinstall that in the 90-degree fuel line, and I'll try to show you guys all of this in a second here. But reinstall this on that 90-degree fuel line, or you can install it directly onto this little stud that KPower includes, and of course the camera's not going to focus, but this little stud that KPower includes to basically plug that fuel line. Alright, so here is the line right here that we disconnected. You can see it's got the stud in there, and I had to get that white clip off of the end of this hard line so that I could reinstall that here, and now this little aluminum stud is not going to be able to pull out of there, which is exactly what you want. So now you can essentially just zip tie this line to the other one to make sure that it doesn't just flop around, or you can zip tie it onto just about anything else down here. But so now you're pretty much good to go on your fuel lines themselves. If you want to just stop here, you can leave these lines installed all the way underneath the car. They're just gonna stick out in the engine bay. They're still just kind of gonna be sitting there. So, and you can see all of the white clips that retain these hard lines all the way down underneath the frame rail here. So I am gonna kind of take a crack at trying to pull off these 2 lines from this so that I can just remove them all together. But if that doesn't work, it's not really a big deal. It's more of just an aesthetic thing in the engine bay where you have 1 fuel line that's actually being used, and you have 2 fuel lines that are just sitting open in the engine bay. So I'm gonna try to remove these, but if I can't, get these clips to work with me, then we'll just leave them in there. It is what it is type of a situation. So let me see if I can take a crack at trying to get these hard lines out. Back up top in the engine bay, before we do any of the running of the fuel lines or anything, we want to go ahead and get our intake manifold put on so that we can then get our fuel rail onto the intake manifold, and then we can run our fuel lines to connect to the back of the fuel rail. So before you go to put your intake manifold on, just do a quick check of all of the sensors and connectors and such on the new wiring harness that are going to be down here underneath the intake manifold. We are going to be using a little bit of Loctite on the bolts to hold the intake manifold in place, so you kind of want to make sure most of your stuff down here is done before you go to put your intake manifold on. We're only going to be using blue Loctite, so it's not going to be anything super crazy, but it's just one of those things. So the mounting surface on my block has been covered with tape for quite a long time and it's looking definitely worse for wear. So I'm gonna just try and scrub this down a little bit with some red Scotch-Brite just to sort of clean up the surface so that the gasket that we're gonna put on here will more or less be able to hold without, you know, having all of this other sort of gunk on this surface. And I just had a thought, before I can even really kind of scrub that down to make sure that it's clean, we are going to have to take off these two studs that are sort of from stock that hold the stock intake manifold in place. The reason that we're going to do that is because of the fact that KPower provided all brand new hardware, and it's all bolts. So these two studs, actually, you can just use the studs and run them that way. I'm going to go ahead and remove them, and I'll show you guys how to do that. So this is going to go for just about any time you have a threaded stud that goes into the block of the engine. If you're trying to remove it, this is sort of the go-to standard way to do so. So you're going to take two nuts of the same size and thread pitch for this stud, and you're essentially going to try to lock them together. You can see how this is, you've got these two lug nuts right here, or, you know, threaded flange style nuts. These were the original two hardwares that were used on these, but now I'm using them to remove this. So basically, once you get these guys more or less sort of cinched down together, then you can rotate the inside one, and as you're trying to more or less unthread this inner bolt, it's not going to be able to move because it's being held in place by this outer nut. And if you want to, you can have a wrench on the inside and a wrench on the outside, and as you're turning the inside one, you can try to make sure that these two are staying tight, and that is how we're going to remove this. There we go, and that guy just comes right out. We have removed the two threaded studs from the side of the engine block for the intake manifold. So now I'm going to go through and actually scrub this front mount surface with some red Scotch-Brite just to clean up all of this oil and kind of garbage. So let's talk about our intake manifold really quick and what we need to do to it before we can actually get it installed. There's a couple of different things. You've got a threaded barb here. This is actually going to be for your brake booster, is going to connect onto this little threaded barb. They included this 90-degree fitting in the kit, and this guy is going to be the other one of the heater hoses that we have not yet connected. That guy is going to have a bypass right here, and it goes through this hole right here on the end of the intake manifold. And then here down on the bottom, this is an idle air control valve port. Because of the fact that the BRZ runs a throttle by wire, meaning sort of a digital throttle body, we don't actually need this for this swap. They use this intake manifold for all kinds of different swaps, and the cars with throttle bodies are actually driven by a physical cable, would have an idle air control valve, but in our case, we don't need that, so we have used the supplied block-off kit for this, and there are 4 button type bolts that actually mount this guy with, there's a gasket that goes under here too, the gasket, the plate, and then these 4 button top bolts hold that in. And I think, I'm not exactly sure what this is intended to hold in place, but there's a mounting bracket here for something not related to this swap. It might be additional mounting for an IACV, but also I think finally we have our map sensor. So this is manifold absolute pressure. I upgraded from the stock one. This is a Skunk 2 4-bar map sensor. Because of the fact that we are going with a turbo setup, our map sensor needs to be able to read higher than what this standard map sensor can read. I believe the stock, you know, any sort of standard map sensor that you would get for a K20 or a K24 would be like an 11 PSI. So this guy is not going to be able to read 14.7 plus however many pounds of boost that we're going to be running. So that's why I upgraded to the Skunk 2 4-bar map sensor. And I believe that just about covers everything on the intake manifold before we get it bolted up. So let's go ahead and mount it to the engine. So I tried to go ahead and install the intake manifold on here, but with this heater hose, the one that goes on the left side, with that installed, it was just too much restriction kind of down here where the manifold bolts in. So I disconnected that line, leave that off to the side for now. What I think I'm going to try to do is get this line on the heater hose connected onto that little 90-degree fitting on the intake manifold, and then mount the manifold, and then try to get this back on that lead. This might be more difficult, but there was no way I was going to get it done with this guy being mounted the way it was in that way. So let's try and get this guy onto that fitting on the manifold, and then try to mount the manifold itself. Now that we've got the intake manifold on, there is one intake manifold bolt that is going to be very difficult, and it is all the way back here down at the bottom. I can just get my finger on it, but trying to get an actual wrench back there, especially a torque wrench, is going to be difficult. But let me see if I can't just slip this in here. Now we're going to have to get some blue Loctite, put just a little bit of Loctite on each one of the 8 bolts that holds this bad boy in place, and then we're going to torque these guys down to 16 foot-pounds. Very specifically, KPower noted, make sure that you only bolt these down to 16, because for whatever reason, these bolts are very prone to stripping inside of the aluminum head of the engine. So, a little bit of blue Loctite and 16 foot-pounds. Now that we've got everything Loctited and put in, we are going to try our best to torque these down to spec. Now there's some of them, like this one, that are going to be really difficult to get a full torque wrench at, but we're going to try. Really trying to just stick to the spec here. With the intake manifold all Loctited and bolted in, torqued to spec, are torqued to 16 foot-pounds, the best that I could possibly manage to get it. Now I do need to get that heater hose reinstalled, this guy right here, installed back over on this port, but that shouldn't be too much trouble. Once I get that back in, let's talk about the fuel rail and the injectors that we're going to be using. So now let's look at our fuel rail from KPower. Now this comes with a couple of different plugs, and as a part of the fuel kit, they include this adapter here, and we're going to need this because the fuel line that's quick disconnect style is going to go around the little ridge right here. We need to be plugging the side with the label on it because it's going to go in this orientation. I thought it was going this way. I was incorrect. So this plug is going to have to come out and go in this side where it says KPower logo, and then we're going to take this little trick hose adapter, and that's going to go on the side without the logo. And for the sake of keeping things pretty, I'm actually going to be using the wrench for my AN hoses. So this is aluminum, so I'm just kind of trying not to scratch any of this stuff. You know, it's nice and pretty. We kind of want to keep it that way. So I'm going to use this to tighten down these fittings. They don't have to be ridiculously, stupidly tight or anything like that, but you want to make sure they're secure. With the plug on the side with the logo and the little adapter on the side without the logo, this guy's going to get installed here. But before we can put this in, we've got to get our injectors mounted up into these 4 slots. So when it comes to injectors, I am using the Grams 1000 cc injectors. You can go with injector dynamics, you can go with whatever you want, but just make sure that when you're ordering your KPower kit, especially if you're doing the wiring kit, that you tell them which port style your injectors have, because most, if not all, injectors have a slightly different plug for the actual wiring to connect into. And so you want to make sure that the injector sub-harness that they send you has connectors that will actually properly plug into your injectors themselves. So here's just a quick look at what these look like. I mean, it looks like an injector. It's not really anything special, but these are the ones that I decided to go with. If you're doing a naturally aspirated build and you're not going turbo, you probably don't need 1000cc injectors. You can probably go with, I don't know, what do they make? 650, 750, something like that. But especially if you're running ethanol, because ethanol requires a higher volume of fuel to be fed into the engine, you're going to want to go with slightly higher injectors. So let's get these guys put into the fuel rail, and then we'll get the fuel rail put on here, and these guys will wedge down into your slots. And so this more or less is what it looks like, and it'll be something like this with the connectors pointing up from where your logo sits so that your actual connectors can go into them. Now, KPower does supply 2 mounting bolts for this, so let's grab those. So we're just going to set the injectors down inside of the barrels, try to make sure they're square. And we're going to take our, get this harness out of the way for a second. Take our hardware, try to mount these in. Fuel rail is on, and I got all of our connectors plugged in. So essentially what I did in order to get this guy in there was, once I threaded on the bolts, I tried to give it a little bit of a push, but not too much, because of the fact that it's, you know, because the injectors were not set down in there yet, they were, you know, not super stable. So I didn't want to apply too much downward pressure while they weren't, you know, perfectly sort of vertical in the slot, right? So once I got my hardware in there, I just did 2 turns on this guy, 2 turns on that guy, back and forth, just trying to sort of slowly work the fuel rail and the injector seals down in to the intake manifold. So that's the fuel rail done. Now, the last thing really we need to do is to get our fuel lines finished up and connected to that little hose barb that we put on earlier. So we've already kind of talked about this a couple times, but this quick connect that is on the frontmost fuel line, the camera doesn't want to focus, but the back one and the middle one are disconnected. I'll cap those off eventually here. I might just loop them with another piece of tubing. But so we've got this guy mounted on here. And I think what I'm going to do is actually try to run this down underneath that AC line so that it comes off of the port or the hard line and down to here. Now we're going to take this end of the ethanol sensor. I don't think it really matters which way the fuel flows through this sensor. All it's doing is just measuring the ethanol content in the fuel. So, but for the sake of the connector needing to point down in this way to get to the harness, I'm going to do mine basically like this, in this kind of a direction instead of like that. So I'm going to connect this line that we just installed to this side right here of the fuel sensor. I'm going to take the other end of this hose here, connect it into the other side, and then take the 90-degree, connect it onto that little hose barb on the end, and then I'll show you guys the little connector wire from this to the harness. Now we've got this little connector cable. The orange side goes to the ethanol sensor, and this 8-pin is going to go onto the 8-pin that's on the chassis harness. Let's see if I can show you guys that. So all the way down in here, this 8-pin connector right here that's connected to the original chassis harness is going to be the one that we're using. And then of course the other end of our ethanol sensor. There's a lot of stuff going on back here. It is very busy underneath this intake manifold, but just is what it is. But so yeah, ethanol sensor, where'd it go? 8-pin connector on the chassis harness right here. That should be more or less your whole fuel system done. Now this thing is starting to look a lot more official with the fuel rail. Obviously the turbo's not in here right now, but it is what it is. So recap. We pulled out the old hard lines. We disconnected the hard line from underneath the fuel tank. We came up here, got our intake manifold bolted in, got our fuel rail with the injectors and all of the sensors there, and then we got our E85 ethanol sensor plugged into the chassis harness. And that's the whole fuel system. And that's gonna wrap it up for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for following the build. All of your comments and your support really means a lot as I'm going through this whole process. Now, we are this close to being able to start this thing up. The only thing that I really have left to do is to fabricate my intercooler piping and my turbo downpipe for the exhaust. Now, that's not necessarily gonna be easy, but we'll get it figured out. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up down below. Subscribe to the channel so you can stay up to date and follow the build and get to see this thing run pretty soon. And until next time, build your dreams.